The parchment crackled beneath weathered fingers as Christopher Columbus spread his charts across the wooden table. In the monastery of Santa Maria di la Rabida, the year was 1491, and the Italian navigator's obsession with reaching the Indies by sailing west had consumed nearly a decade of his life. Brother Juan Perez, the monastery's guardian, watched with fascination as Columbus traced his finger along imagined routes across the uncharted Atlantic. "Your Majesty," Columbus would soon plead before Queen Isabella I and King Ferdinand V of Spain, "the riches of Chipangu and the Indies await beyond the Western Sea." Marco Polo's accounts speak of gold abundant as copper in Christian lands. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Though his calculations were dangerously flawed, Columbus believed the Earth was smaller than it actually was, miscalculating the distance to Asia by thousands of leagues. The Spanish monarchs had initially rejected his proposal in 1486, deeming it too costly and impractical. But now, with Granada finally conquered from the Moors in January of 1492, Spain was flush with victory and ready for new ventures. The Reconquista was complete, and the Catholic monarchs sought to spread their influence beyond Iberian shores. Isabella, against the counsel of her advisors, saw divine providence in Columbus's quest. "We shall support this enterprise," she declared, legend claiming she would pawn her jewels if necessary. The reality was more pragmatic. The crown's financial risk was minimal, as Columbus would fund much of the expedition himself through Genos. Banking connections. The capitulations of Santa Fe, signed on April 17, 1492, granted Columbus extraordinary privileges. He would become Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of any lands discovered, and entitled to 10% of all wealth found. These terms, which seemed generous given the uncertain nature of the voyage, would later prove to be sources of immense conflict. As spring turned to summer, Columbus assembled his fleet in the port of Palos de la Frontera, the Niga, Pinta, and Santa Maria, three vessels that would become legendary, bobbed in the harbor as crews prepared for what many believed would be their final voyage. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, measured barely 85 feet in length, a fragile wooden shell to challenge the vast Atlantic. Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta and respected mariner of Palos, brought credibility to the expedition. Without the Pinzon family's support and their ability to recruit experienced sailors, Columbus's dream might have remained forever anchored in Spanish ports. Vicente Yves Pinzon commanded the Niga, completing the trio of captains who would alter the course of human history. On August 3, 1492, as dawn broke over Andalusia, Columbus knelt in prayer at the Church of St. George before leading his 90 men to their ships. The bells of Palos rang out across the harbor as the three caravels caught the morning wind and set course for the Canary Islands, the last known lands before the ocean sea's mysterious expanse. None aboard could have imagined that their westward journey would not reach the Indies, but would instead open an entirely new world to European eyes, launching an age of exploration that would reshape global civilization forever. The Canary Islands provided Columbus's fleet with their final taste of familiar waters. In late August of 1492, after repairs and provisions, the three ships departed San Sebastian de la Gomera on September 6th, sailing into waters that no European had dared traverse. The ocean sea stretched endlessly westward, its blue expanse holding secrets that would challenge every assumption about the world's geography. Columbus had chosen his route wisely, catching the trade winds that would carry his vessels steadily west. Yet as days turned to weeks, the crew's initial enthusiasm gave way to mounting anxiety. By September 19th, they had sailed farther from land than any European expedition in recorded history. The familiar stars of the Mediterranean had given way to alien constellations, and even the magnetic compass began behaving strangely as they approached the magnetic declination. "Admiral, the men speak of mutiny," Martin Alonso Pinzon warned during one of their ship-to-ship conferences. The sailors whispered of sailing off the edge of the world, of boiling seas and sea monsters that legend claimed inhabited the far Atlantic. Columbus faced his greatest challenge not from the ocean itself, but from the fear festering in the hearts of his men. To maintain morale, Columbus kept logs, one showing the true distance traveled, the other a false account showing shorter distances to convince his crew they had not ventured too far from Spain. This deception, recorded in Bartolomé de las Casas's later account of the voyage, revealed Columbus's understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Strange phenomena. began manifesting as they sailed deeper into unknown waters. Masses of seaweed floated on the surface, which Columbus hoped indicated nearby land, but were actually part of the vast Sargasso Sea. Birds appeared and disappeared, sometimes landing on their ships, raising false hopes of approaching shores. The crew interpreted every sign through the lens of their mounting desperation. On October 7th, the Nias crew spotted what appeared to be land, but dawn revealed only clouds on the horizon. False alarms became frequent torments, each disappointment deepening the sailors' resolve to turn back toward Spain. Columbus had promised the Catholic monarchs he would reach the Indies, and his stubborn persistence bordered on madness as October progressed without sight of land. The breaking point came on October 10th, when the crew of the Santa Maria openly confronted their admiral. 3 more days. Columbus negotiated, knowing that his authority hung by the thinnest of threads. "Grant me 3 more days, and if we find no land, we shall turn back to Spain with honor intact." It was a desperate gamble, for Columbus had no guarantee that land lay within 3 days' sailing. His calculations suggested they should have reached the Indies weeks earlier, and doubt had begun creeping into even his iron-willed conviction. The ocean sea had proven far vaster than any European had imagined, and Columbus faced the possibility that his grand vision was nothing more than the delusion of an obsessed dreamer. Yet on October 11th, subtle signs began appearing that would vindicate his faith. Fresh vegetation floated past their ships, a carved stick was pulled from the water, and land birds flew overhead in patterns suggesting nearby shores. As the sun set on that fateful day, Columbus ordered his ships to proceed cautiously through the night, for he sensed that their long ordeal was finally approaching its climax. The admiral stood at the prow of the Santa Maria, scanning the moonlit horizon with eyes that had grown accustomed to the ocean's deceptions, unaware that within hours, his gamble would forever change the known world. At 2 o'clock in the morning on October 12th, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana aboard the Pinta shattered the pre-dawn silence with the cry that would echo through history, "Tierra, tierra, land, land." The moonlight revealed a dark line against the horizon, and Columbus's impossible dream suddenly materialized into tangible reality. As dawn broke over what Columbus believed was an island near the Indies, the 3 Spanish vessels approached a shore unlike anything they had imagined. Palm trees swayed in tropical breezes, white sand beaches stretched invitingly, and curious figures emerged from the forest to observe these strange floating structures that had appeared from the eastern sea. Columbus, resplendent in his finest scarlet doublet and bearing the royal banner of Castile and Lean, waded ashore onto what the native Taino people called Guanahani. He claimed the island for their Catholic majesties, naming it San Salvador, Holy Savior, in gratitude for divine deliverance from the perils of the ocean sea. The ceremony was witnessed by naked islanders who observed with wonder and growing concern as the bearded strangers performed rituals incomprehensible to their culture. The Taino people, led by their cacique, approached these pale visitors with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Columbus, convinced he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, called them Indians, a misnomer that would persist for centuries. He noted in his journal their copper-colored skin, their generous nature, and their apparent lack of weapons or knowledge of steel. They traded everything they had for anything we offered, Columbus wrote, describing exchanges of glass beads and hawk's bells for gold ornaments and exotic parrots. The Europeans were astounded by the islanders' innocence and generosity, qualities that Columbus interpreted as signs of people ready for conversion to Christianity and subjugation to Spanish rule. For 10 days, Columbus explored the archipelago that would later be known as the Bahamas, searching for the golden cities of Chipangu that Marco Polo had described. Each island revealed new wonders, exotic birds with brilliant plumage, strange fruits, and people who lived in harmony with their tropical paradise. Yet the vast treasures of the Orient remain elusive. This context draws from Bartolomé de Las Casas's extensive documentation of Columbus's voyages and indigenous encounters, preserved in his Historia de las Indias. The Taino spoke of a large island to the south called Colba, which Columbus interpreted as Chipangu itself. On October 28th, his fleet reached the shores of Cuba, where Columbus was certain he would find the Great Khan's magnificent palaces and unlimited wealth. Instead, he discovered more indigenous communities living in bohíos, thatched huts, and cultivating crops unknown to European agriculture. Martin Alonso Pinzon, growing impatient with Columbus's obsession with finding Asian cities, departed in the Pinta to explore on his own, straining the expedition's unity. Columbus continued eastward with the remaining ships, eventually reaching Hispaniola on December 6th, where he encountered the Taino kingdom of the cacique Guacanagari. The island's beauty overwhelmed the Spanish visitors. "This land is the most beautiful that human eyes have beheld," Columbus recorded in his journal. Rivers ran clear and cold from mountain peaks, harbors provided perfect anchorage, and the soil promised abundant harvests. Most importantly, the natives wore golden ornaments and spoke of a place called Cibao where gold could be found in. The rivers. Disaster struck on Christmas Eve when the Santa Maria ran aground on a coral reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The flagship that had carried Columbus across the ocean sea was lost. Its timbers used to construct La Navidad, the first European settlement in the Americas. 39 men volunteered to remain behind while Columbus prepared to return to Spain. With news of his discovery as 1493 dawned, Columbus faced the irony that his greatest triumph had become his most complex challenge. The journey back to Spain tested Columbus's seamanship as severely as the original voyage west. Departing Hispaniola on January 16, 1493, with the Niga and the reunited Pinta, Columbus carried precious cargo that would astound European courts: 6 Taino islanders, exotic parrots, samples of unfamiliar plants, and small quantities of gold that promised vast wealth in the lands he had discovered. The Atlantic crossing proved treacherous, as winter storms battered the 2 remaining caravels. On February 12th, a violent tempest separated the vessels, and Columbus feared that his discoveries might perish with him in the ocean sea's depths. In desperation, he wrote accounts of his voyage on parchment, sealed them in barrels, and cast them overboard, hoping that someday the story of his achievement might reach Spain even if he did not. Providence delivered Columbus to the Portuguese island of Santa Maria in the Azores on February 18th, where suspicious Portuguese authorities initially detained some of his crew, suspecting Spanish encroachment on Portuguese territories. The political implications of Columbus's discovery were already becoming apparent, as Portugal's established African trade routes suddenly seemed less significant than this new western passage to what everyone believed were the Indies. The Niga limped into Lisbon harbor on March 4th, where Columbus faced his most delicate diplomatic challenge. King John II of Portugal, who had previously rejected Columbus's proposal, now realized the magnitude of his error. In a tense audience at the monastery of Santa Maria das Virtudes, Columbus carefully described his discoveries while avoiding details that might encourage Portuguese interference with Spanish claims. After departing Lisbon, Columbus finally reached Palos de la Frontera on March 15, 1493, completing a voyage that had lasted 7 months and 12 days. The bells of Palos rang in celebration as crowds gathered to witness the exotic specimens and captive islanders that Columbus paraded through the streets as proof of his success. Word of Columbus's achievement spread rapidly across Spain, reaching the Catholic monarchs in Barcelona, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, initially skeptical of reports that seemed fantastic to believe, summoned Columbus to court for a formal presentation of his discoveries. The journey from Andalusia to Catalonia became a triumphal procession as Spanish nobles and common citizens alike marveled at evidence of lands beyond the ocean sea. The royal audience in Barcelona's Palau Real Major in April of 1493 marked the pinnacle of Columbus's career. Entering the Great Hall, where the Catholic monarchs held court, Columbus presented his Taino captives, who had been baptized and dressed in European clothing for the occasion. Cages of brilliantly colored parrots, samples of exotic spices, and ornaments of gold provided tangible proof that the admiral had indeed reached the outer islands of the Indies. "Your Majesties," Columbus declared, kneeling before the throne, "I have delivered to your crown the western route to the riches of the Orient and countless souls ready to embrace the true faith." The assembled court listened in amazement as Columbus described islands of perpetual spring, rivers running with gold, and native peoples eager for Spanish governance and Christian salvation. The reference to papal authority and Christian mission resonated powerfully with Isabella and Ferdinand, who saw divine validation of their support for Columbus's enterprise. The Pope would soon issue the Intercatera Bulls, dividing the newly discovered world between Spain and Portugal, and providing religious justification for European colonization of the Americas. Columbus's triumph seemed complete when the monarchs granted him the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and authorized a second, much larger expedition to establish permanent Spanish presence in his discoveries. Yet even as he basked in royal favor, Columbus remained unaware that his achievements surpassed his own understanding. He had not found a western route to Asia, but had instead opened an entirely new world to European exploration and conquest. The enthusiasm surrounding Columbus's return to Spain quickly translated into an ambitious second expedition that would dwarf his original three-ship fleet. On September 25, 1493, 17 vessels departed Cadiz harbor carrying over 1,200 men, soldiers, settlers, craftsmen, and missionaries, all determined to establish Spanish dominion over the newly discovered Indies. This second voyage revealed the true scale of Columbus's achievement and the beginnings of its tragic consequences. The fleet, commanded by Columbus as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, included seasoned conquistadors like Alonso de Ojeda and future explorers who would carve their own paths through the Americas. Unlike the desperate venture of 1492, this expedition sailed with royal confidence and colonial ambitions. The crossing to the Caribbean proved swifter than the first voyage, as Columbus now knew the optimal route through the trade. Whence, on November 3rd, the Spanish fleet reached Dominica, beginning a systematic exploration of the Lesser Antilles that would map the eastern approaches to the Caribbean. Each island revealed new wonders and new peoples, but also growing evidence that these lands bore little resemblance to Marco Polo's descriptions of the Orient. When Columbus reached Hispaniola on November 28th, he discovered the grim fate of La Navidad. The 39 Spanish settlers left behind had been killed by the Taino, their bodies scattered around the burned remains of the fort. The friendly reception Columbus had enjoyed during his first voyage had soured into conflict, as the Spanish colonists' demands for gold and women had violated indigenous customs and triggered violent retaliation. The destruction of La Navidad provided Columbus with his first harsh lesson in colonial administration. The Taino cacique Guacanagari, who had welcomed Columbus the previous year, now spoke of Spanish settlers who had abused their hospitality and provoked warfare with neighboring tribes. The paradise Columbus had described to the Spanish court was revealing itself as a complex world of competing interests and cultural misunderstandings. Undeterred by this setback, Columbus established a new settlement called La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola, naming it in honor of his royal patron. The site, chosen for its harbor and perceived strategic advantages, would become the first permanent European city in the Americas and the launching point for further Spanish expansion throughout the Caribbean. The reality of colonial life quickly dispelled romantic notions about the Indies. Disease struck the Spanish settlers with devastating effect, as European bodies struggled to adapt to tropical conditions and unfamiliar pathogens. Food shortages plagued the colony, as Spanish wheat failed to grow in Caribbean soil, forcing dependence on indigenous crops like cassava and maize that European palates found unpalatable. More troubling was the growing realization that the easy wealth Columbus had promised remained elusive. Gold existed in Hispaniola's rivers and mountains, but extracting it required systematic mining operations rather than simple trade with cooperative natives. The Taino people, initially generous with their modest gold ornaments, possessed neither the vast treasures nor the mining techniques that Spanish colonists expected to find in the Indies. This context is supported by Michel de Cuneo's eyewitness account of the second voyage, preserved in Italian archives and providing detailed descriptions of early colonial conditions. Columbus's response to these challenges revealed the darker implications of his discovery. He implemented a tribute system requiring every Taino adult to deliver a specified quantity of gold or cotton every 3 months, enforced by Spanish soldiers and marked by copper tokens that became symbols of indigenous subjugation. Those who failed to meet these demands faced severe punishment, including mutilation or death. The encomienda system that emerged from these early colonial experiments would become a fundamental institution of Spanish America, granting colonists control over indigenous labor and tribute in exchange for providing protection and Christian instruction in practice. The encomienda often amounted to slavery disguised by legal terminology and religious justification. As Columbus explored the southern coast of Cuba during his second voyage, he remained convinced that he had reached the mainland of Asia. He forced his crew to sign legal documents swearing that Cuba was indeed part of the Asian continent, demonstrating how powerfully his preconceptions shaped his interpretation of evidence that contradicted his geographical theories. Columbus's discoveries triggered an unprecedented wave of maritime exploration that would transform the known world. Within a single generation, the news of Western lands reached every European court, inspiring rival nations to launch their own expeditions and challenging Spain's monopolistic claims to the Indies. The age of exploration had truly begun, with consequences that would reshape global civilization. King Manuel I of Portugal, haunted by his predecessor's rejection of Columbus, commissioned Vasco da Gama to find the true sea route to the Indies by sailing around Africa. Da Gama's successful voyage of 1497 to 1499, reaching Calicut and establishing direct Portuguese trade with Asia, proved that Columbus had not actually reached the Orient, but had discovered something potentially more significant, an entirely new continent. The Portuguese achievement in finding the genuine route to Asian spices and silks initially seemed to overshadow Columbus's Western discoveries. Portuguese merchants returned from India with cargoes worth 60 times their expedition costs, while Spanish colonists in the Caribbean struggled to extract modest quantities of gold from reluctant Taino miners. Yet the long-term implications of Columbus's voyage would prove revolutionary in ways that contemporaries could not yet comprehend. In England, King Henry VII authorized John Cabot, another Italian navigator, to explore the northern reaches of the Western Ocean. Cabot's voyage of 1497 reached the coast of Newfoundland, establishing English claims to North America and demonstrating that Columbus's discoveries extended far beyond the Caribbean islands. The cod fisheries that Cabot reported would prove more valuable to England than all the gold Spain extracted from its American colonies. French interest in Western exploration emerged under King Louis XII, who commissioned Giovanni da Verrazzano to search for a passage through the American landmass to reach Asia. Verrazzano's voyage of 1524 mapped the Atlantic coast from Carolina to Nova Scotia, revealing the continental scale of the barriers that blocked the western route to the Indies. These expeditions established the foundation for future French claims to North America and the Great Lakes region. The most significant challenge to Columbus's interpretation of his discoveries came from Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator who participated in several voyages to the South American coast between 1499 and 1504. Vespucci's letters, widely circulated throughout Europe, argued convincingly that these western lands constituted a new world entirely separate from Asia, not the outer islands of the Indies as Columbus maintained. Martin Waldseemüller's famous map of 1507, produced in the monastery of St. Didevasches, first applied the name America to the southern continent in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. This cartographic decision reflected growing European recognition that Columbus had discovered not a western route to the Orient, but previously unknown continents that would require complete revision of geographical understanding. The Spanish response to these challenges was to accelerate exploration and colonization of their American territories. Vasco Noas de Balboa's crossing of the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, when he became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from American shores, revealed the true scope of the continental barrier separating the Atlantic and Pacific. Balboa's achievement demonstrated that reaching Asia from the west would require circumnavigating massive continents, not merely island hopping through the Caribbean. Ferdinand and Magellan's ambitious attempt to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west succeeded in proving the global scope of Columbus's achievement. Magellan's expedition of 1519 to 1522, completed after his death by Juan Sebastian Elcano, achieved the first circumnavigation of the globe and demonstrated that the Americas were indeed separate continents surrounded by vast oceans. The establishment of regular transatlantic trade routes following Columbus's voyages created the first truly global economy. Spanish treasure fleets carrying American silver to European markets financed everything from art and architecture to warfare and exploration. The influx of precious metals from the New World caused inflation throughout Europe while funding Spanish expansion and cultural flowering during the Golden Age. Colonial settlements spread throughout the Caribbean and along the American coasts. As European nations competed for territorial claims and commercial advantages, each new colony required additional voyages, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of exploration and settlement that would continue for centuries. The final years of Columbus's life revealed the complexity of his achievement and the growing realization that his discoveries had exceeded even his own grand ambitions. During his third voyage of 1498 to 1500, Columbus reached the South American mainland near the Orinoco River Delta, where the volume of fresh water flowing into the sea convinced him that he had found one of the four rivers of paradise described in biblical tradition. Yet even as Columbus expanded geographical knowledge with each voyage, his skills as a colonial administrator proved inadequate to the challenges of governing Spanish settlements in the Americas. Reports of his harsh treatment of both Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples reached the Spanish court, leading to his arrest and return to Spain in chains during 1500. The admiral of the Ocean Sea, who had opened the western route to unknown worlds, found himself stripped of governmental authority over the lands he had claimed for Spain. The fourth and final voyage of Columbus, from 1502 to 1504, took him along the Central American coast in a desperate search for the strait that would lead to the Indian Ocean and vindicate his belief that he had reached the outlying regions of Asia. Shipwrecked on Jamaica and facing hostile indigenous peoples, Columbus spent a year stranded before rescue ships arrived from Hispaniola. He returned to Spain a broken man, still convinced that his discoveries were part of the Asian continent. Described by ancient geographers, Columbus died in Valladolid on May 20th, 1506, never fully comprehending the magnitude of his achievement. He had not found the western route to the Indies, but had instead opened to entire continents to European exploration and colonization. His miscalculations about the size of the earth had led to the greatest geographical discovery in human history, proving that sometimes the most significant achievements emerge from flawed but persistent dreams. The immediate consequences of Columbus's voyages transformed both the old and new worlds with unprecedented speed and scope. Within 50 years of his first landing in the Bahamas, Spanish conquistadors had toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, established colonies from Mexico to Chile, and created the first global empire in human history. Cities like Havana, Lima, and Mexico City rose from wilderness to become centers of commerce and culture rivaling their European counterparts. The demographic catastrophe that befell indigenous American populations represented the darkest aspect of Columbus's legacy. European diseases, against which Native Americans had no immunity, killed an estimated 90% of the indigenous population within a century of first contact. Entire civilizations vanished, their languages, customs, and knowledge systems lost forever to the colonial transformation of the Americas. The Columbian Exchange, as historians term the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures between the old and new worlds, fundamentally altered global civilization. European horses, cattle, and pigs transformed American landscapes and indigenous societies, while American crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes revolutionized European agriculture and cuisine. The silver mines of Potosi funded Spanish power, while contributing to global inflation and economic transformation. The navigational techniques and cartographic knowledge developed during Columbus's voyages became the foundation for the age of exploration that followed. Spanish pilots created the first accurate charts of transatlantic routes, while innovations in ship design and navigation instruments made regular ocean voyages possible. For the first time in human history, the compass, astrolabe, and quadrant that guided Columbus across the ocean sea became essential tools for explorers worldwide. Modern assessments of Columbus reflect the complexity of his historical role. He was simultaneously a visionary navigator whose courage opened new worlds, and a colonial administrator whose policies initiated centuries of indigenous oppression. His miscalculations led to world-changing discoveries, while his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the true nature of his findings revealed the limitations of his geographical understanding. The quincentennial celebrations of 1492 prompted renewed examination of Columbus's legacy, with indigenous rights activists and historians challenging traditional narratives that portrayed his voyages as purely heroic achievements. Contemporary scholarship recognizes both the navigational brilliance that enabled his transatlantic crossings and the devastating consequences his discoveries had for Native American civilizations. Columbus's quest that began with a simple desire to reach the Indies by sailing west ultimately sparked the first global age of maritime exploration, colonial expansion, and cultural exchange. His 3 small ships crossing the ocean sea in 1492 initiated a transformation of human civilization that continues to shape our interconnected world today, demonstrating how individual ambition and historical accident can combine to alter the course of human history forever.